Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Daryl, and welcome to our next session, which looks into regulations, both in the US, in Europe, and Asia. Joining me today, I'm very thrilled to have these panelists with us. Firstly, we have Neil Stewart, who is the Director of Corporate Outreach at ISSB. Neil, do you quickly want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I'm in my role as Director of Corporate Outreach for the ISSB. I work directly with issuers, building awareness and understanding of our standards. And the ISSB, which was created under the IFRS Foundation just about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, houses the new ISSB standards, which I'm going to talk about today, as well as the SASB standards. And indeed, last year, we consolidated the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, into the IFRS Foundation. Very pleased to be invited to speak to the forum and to be sharing the platform with Christian and Matt.
Fantastic, that's great. And yeah, Christian, to give you your full introduction, you're a partner for the sustainability and ESG at Deloitte. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your work as well.
Sure. Well, good afternoon and great to be with you all today. I lead our sustainability and ESG services here at Deloitte in the US and globally and have done so for over a decade now. And I like to say more has happened in the last 10 months, 10 days, 10 minutes than the last 10 years combined. But in that role, I've had the privilege of working very closely with Neil, Matt, and teams in all of the market shaping infrastructure that's really helped to accelerate transparency around impacts, risks, and opportunities of business and bring that rigor that's really needed. And now we're seeing the role of assurance really feature very prominently in this evolution. So really pleased to be here. I also had the privilege of chairing our profession body, the AICPA's Sustainability Assurance and Advisory Services Task Force. And so bring that lens to how are the assurance providers evolving? There's a lot of clarity that market participants are looking for in terms of the role of assurance. How can that really be a tool to accelerate this really important, valuable transparency that's absolutely critical to confidence in the market?
Fantastic. No, I think that's great. And definitely, that assurance side of things is something that we're really going to try and dig into in this session as well. Last but by no means least, we've got Matthew Rusk, who is head of GRI in North America. Matthew, do you want to give a quick introduction as well?
Absolutely. Great to be here. Thanks for having me and looking forward to the session. I'm based here in New York City. I oversee GRI's presence in the US and Canada. That includes engagement with diverse constituency groups, including reporting organizations themselves, the report service providers, as well as data users. Work entails really growing awareness of the GRI standard. So the evolving sustainability and ESG reporting landscape that has felt like it's changed more in the last 10 months than the last 10 years in many ways. And GRI's role in that evolving landscape. Also, beyond our free public good, that is our standards, the different resources that we have to help reporters understand, the linkage between GRI and other standards. So we have reporting guides with SASB. We have one that will be newly out with the ESRS. We have a GRI Academy and community. So getting some of those information about those tools and resources out to those that can benefit from them. And if you're unfamiliar with GRI is the most widely used ESG and sustainability reporting standards that covers organizations' impact on the economy, environment, and society. And our standards are currently used by over 11,000 organizations across the world. And our standards are referenced or required in policies in over about 260 policies now in 85 different countries, including the new European Sustainability Reporting Standard. So we're a part of this evolving landscape and excited to collaborate more to do just that.
Fantastic. No, thank you for that, Matthew. And for everyone that's listening back at home, as you can see, we've got a wealth of expertise on this panel. So please do make sure that you take advantage of our experts and ask questions throughout the webinar. We will make sure that we give some time to address those as well. But yeah, you know, Kristen, you mentioned that there have been so many developments on a regulatory front, particularly in recent years, that maybe that's a good place to start, is just to try and make sense of this from a sort of 10,000-foot view as well. So maybe starting with the US, Kristen, if I can come to you, what does the regulatory landscape look like in the US right now? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. You know, I think if we step back a little bit and just think about this fundamental shift that we're seeing in the market, and I know a number of the panelists before us have focused on the recognition that you know, risks related to climate and broader ESG matters are increasingly creating measurable financial impact. That's why investors care. That's why regulators care. That's why there's such a capital markets sort of confluence of attention to the need for data, right? It all comes down to data to truly inform decision making. And you've got investors, you know, dissatisfied with the current state of access, timeliness, reliability of current ESG data. We've made a lot of progress with the two organizations on this panel, as well as many others, to bring some consistency and standardization. But there's still such an opportunity to really accelerate. And we know at the end of the day, disclosure is not the objective or the solution, but it's a critical catalyst to drive accountability and really the behavior change that we need to see. And so I think, you know, we've got a tremendous pace of activity around the world. I think from a US perspective, the Securities and Exchange Commission clearly came out with a 4-part ESG agenda. We are all anxiously awaiting the final climate disclosure, risk and disclosure rule that's now, you know, 18, 19 months in the making. I do think, though, that we've seen a number of other really critical developments that are all sort of really accelerating the US corporate landscape towards action in a very meaningful way. Clearly, developments around the world, namely within the EU and other parts of the world, with the extraterritorial implications, have really been you know, driving behavior, even in the absence of an SEC rule. And we saw recently with the state of California climate legislation that there is clear accountability that's going to come through other mechanisms. And so I think that there is just this rapid mobilization. I think that the really optimistic way to look at this is that there is a very clear sort of organizing framing around the capital markets infrastructure, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the Global Reporting Initiative, how both really look to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that now will fall under the oversight of the IFRS Foundation, and the GHG Protocol, which again is really the foundation of both the SEC's proposal as well as the California climate legislation. So I think just kind of taken together, there are very clear actions, no regrets, actions that every organization, US companies in particular, should really be accelerating on in a manner that will help prepare and drive that sort of reporting agility, if you will, as the regulatory developments around the world are further solidified.
No, that's fantastically put. And yeah, I think it's great that you mentioned about the implications of some of those global regulations, because, you know, it's not just, let's say we're talking about the climate rule at the SEC. That isn't the only piece of regulation out there. You know, with the EU taxonomy that's being developed, a lot of US-based companies are going to find that they fall within that scope as well, and it's really going to impact their reporting. So fantastic points there. Neil, I'd love to hear your 10,000-foot view from the sort of ISSB perspective.
Fantastic, Steve. So I think the best way to give you a sense of the progress that the ISSB has made, where we're at and where we're going to go, is to give you quick 5 headlines from a 6-week period over the summer. So number one, June 26th, we launched our first 2 standards, S1 and S2. S1 is a general disclosure requirement standard guiding companies to disclose their sustainability related risks and opportunities across the full spectrum of ESG. S2 is a climate-specific standard with climate requirements incorporating the TCFD recommendations. Both S1 and S2 add the industry-specific layer because that's really how investors get their most decision-useful information, is to be able to compare apples to apples within an industry. Second announcement, July 6th, the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, which had set up the TCFD, announced that they saw the ISSB standards as the culmination of the TCFD's work. They were handing over responsibilities for monitoring climate risk disclosure, really passing the baton for the TCFD recommendations to the ISSB. Next headline, July 25th, IOSCO, that's the International Organization of Securities Commissions, representing 130 regulators around the world, including the SEC, including the UK, FCA, and so on, accounting for 95% of the world's market capitalization, announced that they had completed their review of the ISSB standards and were endorsing the standards for consideration by their members around the world. This is huge. This is really, really big. I can't overstate it. Going back 2020, this is the only precedent IOSCO endorsed the IFRS accounting standards for use around the world, now used in 144 countries. We see a similar trajectory coming for the ISSB standards. Fourth announcement, July 27th. This one's a lot nerdier than the others, might not seem so important, but actually it's really important. And that's where we issued our digital taxonomy, our draft digital taxonomy, or XBRL tagging for sustainability disclosure. Having this underlying digital language is so important in ensuring the integrity of the data from gathering it, storing it, verifying it, assuring it, reporting it, having it used by investors, as well as the interoperability between standards and between jurisdictions, having that common digital language, very, very important. Last headline, July 31st, when the final form of the CSRD was issued by the European Commission, we were able to announce jointly with the EC as well as EFRAG, the European Standard Setter, that we have achieved a very high degree of alignment in our climate requirements. So making it much easier, reducing the burden, reducing the complexity for companies that will be doing both ISSB and CSRD reporting. Now, if I could leave with one thing, and it goes back to the message that Christian had around the reporting agility. Thinking about these new standards, this is not just another set of standards. This is not just growing the alphabet soup. We are harmonizing, we are converging, but most importantly, this is a new paradigm of reporting for an era of mandatory climate and other sustainability reporting. This is a way to help companies get across that transition from voluntary to mandatory reporting, to be able to bring up the reporting to the level of rigor, to that investor grade level of reporting that they need to do now, where sustainability information and data is alongside and even inside the financial statements. This is what the ISSB standards really bring in, this new era of reporting. And to Christian's point, again, they're increasingly seen by U.S. companies as a no regrets approach to that future rigor of reporting, including mandatory reporting in the U.S.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, really great, and always good to give us 5 or 6 key takeaways as well, particularly those bits around the digital language and the importance of that, and yeah, developments with the Security Commission's organization as well, I think is great. Matt, I'd love to bring you in just to give us the Global Reporting Initiative's perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from our vantage point, of course, the direction of travel is clear. More ESG and sustainability data is of interest to investors and other stakeholders, and jurisdictions are now really catching up to where the voluntary market has been, but realizing that in an effort to get more comparable and consistent data that is more credible, these mandates are needed, and we're in support of that. So the good news is those jurisdictions are leveraging the progress made in the disclosure of sustainability related information that has come through the voluntary reporting frameworks and standards. So we've already acknowledged how much SASB and TCFD has been used by certain markets, and I mentioned the global use of GRI. The market demands there for investors and capital providers, as well as different stakeholders, have led to kind of this acknowledgement in the EU of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and this has global ramifications. So from the onset, GRI has aimed to be a global standard setter that serves different stakeholders' interests. One of those stakeholders is investors, and we focus on impact materiality, and that is where this CSRD directive out of EU is going to pull in mandates for about 50,000 organizations to cover double materiality, which maybe we'll get into a little bit more details later. But the good thing is that they continue to build off of the voluntary landscape. So that includes bringing GRI in with eFrank, the entity mentioned before, as a co-constructor. So the alignment with those new mandates is quite high with the impact disclosure that GRI has created by bringing in multiple stakeholder groups to create standards that speak to impact materiality. They're also clearly mindful, as Neil brought up, about TCFD and ISSB, so really creating that interoperability. So we're really pleased with the role that GRI has played in those EU standards, which will have global ramifications, with organizations being pulled in with quite light thresholds for subsidiaries of organizations headquartered elsewhere to be pulled into that mandate. So this kind of leads us to see a two-pillar, two-perspective corporate reporting system happening globally, definitely led by some of the different jurisdictions focused on climate disclosures that are relevant to financial materiality, paired with this EU move, as well as elevated stakeholder expectations that had been there in that voluntary reporting space, but now with it here to stay thanks to the EU's move for this requirement. And so you see them cover double materiality, underpinning kind of that these two pillars, one focused on financial materiality, one on impact materiality, but leveraging the proof of concept that has already been there, with so many organizations already looking to these global standards from independent standard bodies that have always had an aim to get to a place where they can be assured and consistent, and these mandates will certainly mature that process.
No, I think that's great, and it's fantastic that we're getting into the discussion around materiality. And if I can just sort of ask you to expand on that as well, Matt. You mentioned the different types of materiality, from impact materiality to financial materiality as well. Can you just expand on that a little bit, what the different approaches are and how it relates to regulations, and ultimately how people will be reporting as well?
Yeah, to break it down a bit, so clearly SEC's mandate is to focus on investor interest and needs. So that's where we'll kind of call one pillar the financial materiality pillar, really focused on investors in capital markets. Then there's another pillar focused on an organization's impact out on the world. So that first one, maybe you can see it as, how does sustainability topics and ESG issues have an impact on the organization? And the second, what is the organization's impact out on the world? So that, of course, is aimed at the interest of a broader spectrum of stakeholders. And this is where I reference the different stakeholders we brought into our standard setting process. We always have 5 constituency groups represented in that process. So it's investors, business enterprise, civil society, labor, and mitigating institutions. And so that's where we see this impact pillar, where GRI resides. Financial materiality, of course, we're very excited about the convergence taking place under the ISSB, really focused on that aspect of the two pillars. And then, given the EU's CSRD and the mandate to speak to both pillars, it kind of is that connective tissue. So I'm really pleased when we talk about convergence and everything coming together, that EFRAG and ISSB is working together for interoperability, as well as we very closely working closely with EFRAG as that co-constructor. That's been to date to produce what you see now as the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, but also with the intention to continue to collaborate to bring more consistency, to not have double reporting. So that's even led to the statement from EFRAG that if you're a GRI reporter, you're well prepared to accommodate the needs or the disclosure mandates that are coming out of the ESRS. So that's where the two pillars sit. Certainly some of that is taking place due to different jurisdictional mandates. Some is elevated stakeholder expectations. Certainly with those 50,000 organizations being pulled directly into that EU mandate, they will have to focus on these two perspectives. But also we anticipate seeing elevated stakeholder interest in this, because if you have double materiality transparency in organizations out of one jurisdiction but not others, that doesn't really bring the consistency and comparability. So that's where GRI hopes to play a global role as we continue to move forward and more jurisdictions pull out disclosure mandates, yes, for capital markets and investors, but maybe also for other interest on impact as well.
Fantastic. No, thank you for that. And Neil, it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on materiality as well, and particularly, how it relates to what is going to be expected in terms of obligations for businesses, sort of in the US and overseas as well.
Sure. So the ISSB is 100% focused on the information needs of investors. That's why the ISSB was created, to meet the needs of investors. And we use the same definition of materiality as the IFRS accounting standards. And basically, it's the same that we use in the US under the SEC, which is that information is material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could influence investor decisions. Now, the first key point is that for US companies, this model of financial materiality is incredibly powerful. Sustainability-related risks and opportunities are business drivers. This is not about doing good at the expense of shareholder value. It's plainly risk management. It's just good business, and you can demonstrate it clearly through your disclosures. But I want to also look at, talking about the difference with Europe and this additional layer called impact materiality that Matt explained. A company's impacts on the environment and society that don't affect its prospects. Now, Matt talked about an organization's impact out on the world, and there is a risk of running into confusion to suggest that financial materiality doesn't include a company's impacts on the environment and society. The fact is that a company's ability to generate cash flows over the short, medium, and long term is inextricably linked to the relationships and dependencies, the impacts throughout its value chain. So whether it's emissions or it's DEI in the workforce or it's biodiversity and land use, a company's external impacts are very likely to affect its prospects. It could be in the form of reputation, the cost of carbon, the ability to attract and retain talent, and so on. So many ways that the ISSB standards do require financially material information to be provided about external impacts on resources and relationships. And again, back to my point, a very powerful tool for US companies, and especially going forward under the regulation, whether it's for California or an SEC climate rule or an SEC human capital rule.
Fantastic. No, that's great. And Christian, just to bring you in here as well, how do different standards drive greater consistency around how companies are going to determine materiality? And maybe you can tell us a bit around the role of those sort of internal controls in driving the prioritization of different material ESG topics as well.
Yeah, maybe just building off of Neil and Matt's comments, I think, standards clearly drive greater transparency around criteria. And I think when you step back and think about, as both Matt and Neil highlighted, the intended audience is so incredibly important in really that frame of reference around materiality. And clearly standards drive risk protection. They drive that rigorous adherence to established criteria, and they enable assurance. The one thing that we know is that regulation around the world, as we've already touched on a little bit, is going to differ. That is a certainty, right? But really looking to a standards infrastructure, no different than current corporate reporting, to really establish that clear roadmap, that set of internal conditions and infrastructure, the capacity that's needed, the systems, the controls, the processes that are needed, is really that pathway to, as we talked before, is really engaging in those no regrets moves, and instilling that confidence that you are going to be well prepared as an organization to disclose through whichever avenue, whether it's regulatory driven or more voluntary driven, that you're going to be well positioned to meet the information needs of your intended stakeholders. I think there's a big question around, will all of this form of disclosure become regulated disclosure? And I think that there's such an important opportunity at this point in the market, and as these standards are evolving, to really illustrate what does interoperability really look like. It's how do you build the structure for today, but also anticipating where this market is headed as all of these standards will evolve, but to best position the company to not just comply with requirements, but actually get to the heart of the data that is so incredibly important and increasingly important to managing through a series of disruptive and a highly dynamic market from an environmental, societal conditions. And so I think, again, getting back to standards help drive that consistency, that confidence, the ability to really rapidly mobilize internally to focus on the quality of the data and how that data is being used, whether it's for external disclosure or internal management decision-making or additional uses.
Fantastic. No, that's great, Kristen. Thank you for that. And just a reminder for everyone back at home, do try and put your questions in, whether they're questions or even comments. Share your thoughts as well. Pop them in the question section, and we'll make sure that we address them. I'd love to move this on a little bit as it relates to some of those regulations that directly affect companies, or those regulations that affect investors as well. So maybe starting off with investors, and if I can stay with you, Kristen, what sort of data or information are investors requiring as a result of their regulations, and are investors seeking to know how business leaders are managing climate risk, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a really important continuation of the discussion around materiality, that investors are really looking to understand what are those impacts, risks, or opportunities that could compromise the organization's ability to drive value into the future over defined time horizons. As well as, importantly, not just the disclosure, but the commitments, the policies, the metrics that are being used to really help illustrate how the company is looking to take advantage of not only these market disruptors, but the regulatory trends. There's tremendous opportunity. We talk a lot about, regulation really serving as a catalyst for business transformation. I think investors are here sort of the capital markets lens of, data and how and what avenues to access data in a way that actually provides that insight into that risk profile today and into the future. In terms of exact data specifications, it really does vary, again, continuing with the materiality point. If you're talking about a heavy manufacturer versus a financial services institution versus a retailer, what are those, 5 to 7 really material environmental and societal factors that with more better data could truly inform greater insight into how that company will be resilient in a future state. as it relates to climate in particular, there's a lot of debate around, is Scope 3 in or not? What does it truly tell you? Do investors really care? And I would go back to even some of the messaging from regulators and standard setters that really Scope 3 measurement and looking to the standards in particular that guide a way a company organizes, prioritizes, determines materiality, and then measures Scope 3 is really, again, a tool, a sort of a risk protection mechanism to drive an adherence to, the way in which a company can communicate confidently their transition profile. And every organization, every investor is looking for the transition potential of an organization. And actually, a company can control that messaging. And the other benefit is that the GHG protocol, which is the leading standard in the market, well, there's a lot of concern and a lot of opportunity for maturity around Scope 3 emissions reporting. The GHG protocol provides guidance and helpful tools around how do you determine measurement uncertainty. And all of those steps can actually help strengthen a company's disclosure and transparency to protect against that sort of data uncertainty concern that is the biggest, area of focus in the market. So I think there are avenues to provide investors with really important insight, even at a point in time in the market and the standards landscape that we're still maturing and driving a sophistication and rigor and maturity of standards. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that's what investors are looking for.
Absolutely. And Christian, just to build on that as well, one thing you mentioned at the beginning was around that quality of data. And so it'd be really interesting to hear from your perspective, what investor expectations are around data reliability and how have they sort of evolved in recent years as well?
Yeah, and actually, we Deloitte performed some research around sort of readiness potential in the market, and from a corporate perspective, we saw that companies, their biggest challenges were with the data underpinning all of this strategic focus all the way through to disclosure. So the availability, the confidence in data sources and timeliness, and then reliability. And how do those sort of constraints, those biggest challenges, actually help drive a prioritization of where companies are headed so that they're better positioned to not only comply with these standards, but provide information to investors. I think there was a quote that I saw a couple of weeks ago that in a recent global investor survey that 87% of investors felt that there's some form of greenwashing, whether intentional or otherwise, in current sustainability reporting. And so I think that point around whether intentional or otherwise, the obscuring of information is a real risk for companies. And I get back to standards adherence and that certainty that drives in terms of how a company communicates is so incredibly important. And then strengthening the confidence that even external stakeholders or internal, the board, internal C-suite leaders can have through the use of independent attestation and assurance is an incredible tool, and one that will really help to strengthen that confidence that investors can place in this information.
Oh, that's brilliant. And that's quite a statistic as well. 87% of investors feeling that, there is greenwashing out there in some form. So definitely something to solve as well. Matt, I'd love to bring you in around this, just around what sort of investors expect, one of your key stakeholder groups. And yeah, their expectations around ESG data and that kind of stuff. What are your views?
Yeah, we touched upon it being a constituency group that's involved with our standard setting process. And I think Neil's point was a great one about, you can't quite disconnect the impact and how things then are financially relevant, right? Your stakeholders help determine the success of the organization. So there's no surprise to realize that with them as a subgroup of our stakeholders that we're speaking of, or looking to cater to, there is that through line to those that are also specifically focused on that group. That's why you do see kind of natural interoperability and also key collaborations in the space to even more solidify connectivity and interoperability between other standards. We're actually embarking on a refresh to our climate standard. Our climate standard, if you follow our emission standard in climate, you actually go a long way to satisfy TCFD. Well, we're having a revision to our standards with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as part of our working group to build off of the great work that they've done to bring about more alignment. And what's great about that is we're getting a refreshed feedback on what investors represented in that technical committee want in their data, but also we're going to be embarking on a public comment period launching this month. So we'll hear that directly from the market. So we encourage all different stakeholders to look at that and provide feedback. And then you can certainly see the feedback that's there. So you can see what investors are asking in that regard, whether it's because of their interest outside of different jurisdictional mandates, or so they can then accommodate the different jurisdictional mandates. And through that, we all do create that global common language where we avoid intentional or unintentional greenwashing, because that's certainly an issue we see prevalently. I've been inside sustainability and CSR departments, and there is you have to up the sustainability literacy for a lot of different groups, and investors are no different, or those that are disclosing to investors are no different. So interesting moment in time for that with climate, and we see also a lot of celebration, including us celebrating what the ISSB is doing with that global baseline. There is that recognition too that an impact materiality assessment, as identified in GRI 3 and part of the ESRS standards, really do go through that stakeholder engagement process, help with that risk assessment based upon impacts the organization has, which then certainly can help to inform what will be financially relevant. So we're hearing that from investors. It was fascinating to see that also supported in an ISS survey, where 75% of the investors indicated that they believe that companies' materiality assessment should include impact on society and the environment. So it all kind of works together, and that's what we'll continue to do with collaborating with the ISSB, EFRAG, and others, listening to those investor audiences. So we do really get standards that create that common language and create that assurability when it comes to disclosure.
Fantastic, thanks. Neil, obviously ISSB was created with investors in mind, so it'd be great to finish off with you on this topic as well and hear your thoughts around what they expect.
Well, I want to throw something out, a comment that I heard from an institutional investor. First of all, and to preface this, there's no doubt that this data is vitally important to investors in terms of portfolio construction, portfolio risk, simple stock picking decisions. But one investor I heard, I thought was interesting. A company said, "Why do you need this data? How are you using this data?" And the investor admitted, "Actually, we're not using the data, but we want to know that you, the company, are using this data," right? They want to know that management have their arms around this, that they recognize the risk areas, and that they're managing the business accordingly. And one area I want to kind of circle back to, I thought I really liked Christian's point about how important this is in terms of risk and strategy for the business, right? This is not just investor grade data. This is board ready data that's needed for capital allocation decisions within the company, right? How to set strategy and how to manage risk. It's used for M&A due diligence. And of course, it's used up and down the supply chain in contracts. One controversial area is Scope 3. And companies might question, well, why do we need to report Scope 3? Often we don't have control over it. And the fact is that investors do need Scope 3 data. It is the best indicator of both upstream and downstream risks through this energy transition, whether a company has control or not. Oftentimes it does have control, like where it makes its products, but other times it may not. But either way, it shows energy transition risks, and all companies, practically all companies, have some energy transition risks. So we acknowledge that in many cases, the Scope 3 data isn't ready yet. It isn't necessarily good enough yet in terms of timeliness or quality, but we've got to get there. And I think investors would recognize and would encourage companies to get there with Scope 3.
Fantastic. No, that's great. And I think that moves us on quite nicely to look into the future as well. And we have actually had an audience question around this as well. They sort of say kudos to moving to an assurable base of risk metrics, but seeing as most of the actual value of an enterprise is its discounted, risk-adjusted future cash flows, how are you thinking about the future as it relates to ESG risk, climate risk? And I guess just to sort of interpret that a little bit, you know, looking at those hardcore kind of financial valuations of a company versus ESG risk and how it plays into company valuation. So a little bit of a tough one. So great question. But Christian, maybe do you want to touch on that at all, or if we've got any willing volunteers?
Sure, I can jump in quickly. I know we're short on time, so I'm sure my fellow panelists will want to as well. I think it's a great point. And again, it gets back to the point we've talked about throughout this discussion about materiality. And this concept that the way value is measured and to whom value is delivered is changing. And I think the discipline that companies can increasingly integrate into tested management systems to really integrate data, technical capabilities, governance, and controls to better sense, better anticipate, and better equip the company to really make really sound decisions and choices based on evidence and based on data. I mean, ESG is a data-driven way to understand long-term value. And so I think that the first step is meaningful, high-quality information that drives trust and drives transparency and accountability. And so I think it's a very complicated question, but it all comes down to the data for sure, and the quality of that data.
Absolutely great. And Neil, maybe just as we're talking about the future, it'd be great to hear your perspective on what we can expect over the next 12 to 18 months.
Sure. Well, you know, as we've talked, this is about a transition to mandatory reporting in many jurisdictions around the world, including in the US. Even before the ISSB was created, a lot of countries were on the path to mandatory TCFD reporting, like the UK, Hong Kong, others. And now we see them recognizing the ISSB standards are what they need to get there, right, for mandatory climate reporting. We're already seeing, especially with the recent IOSCO endorsement, this accelerating pace. Just recently, Brazil made a really major announcement, voluntary use of the ISSB standards starting in 2024, mandatory starting in 2025. The UK is on track, wants to be an early mover, a pioneer in using the ISSB standards. We also see moves in Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and on around the world. So we see this accelerating pace of jurisdictional adoption, but at the same time, what we really need to make sure of is that we bring along all the stakeholders that need to get up to speed. We think of this from the ISSB's perspective as capacity building. It includes the jurisdictions, the countries, national regulators, it includes the standard setters, it includes the preparers, obviously, and most importantly, it also includes the users, and it includes the accounting profession. So with the standards now out, our focus, one of our biggest focuses, is on this capacity building, education, training, and you can look for some key announcements later this month at COP28.
Excellent. That's great. Hey, Daryl.
Great. Well done, guys. That was fabulous. You covered so much great material, really relevant updates in terms of what's happening in this space. And it's so good to see the progress, right? All over the lot, the alphabet soup that you all talked about, it's beginning to come together here around the key audiences and getting us a good foundation, a good base. And of course, you know, we'll talk a little bit more. We'll hear from CCP's Jenna Moore on, you know, once you have a base, you know, the next thing is, okay, so what's going to happen next? Great what you did. Where are you going forward? We know that's how the investing and business world works as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. But thanks very much for everybody's engagement, participation, and the progress we've really seen. You can remember where we were not long ago. Trying to get, I remember when we first got GRI and SASB in the same room. It took months because of and now people are really working together because we can see the benefits of that. So thanks to everybody for your hard efforts. For our audience, we're going to take a few-minute break, and then we're going to be back with CEO Vijay Manth Rasgra from the CEO of Montrose Environmental, who's going to share his ongoing sustainable plans here as we go forward. So thanks again for the group. Much appreciated. Be back in 5.
Thank you.
Thanks all.